A devout young woman travels 1,000 miles to marry a frontier businessman who advertised for a practical wife, only to be cruelly dismissed for being too pious. Stranded in a rough mining town with dwindling resources, she finds unexpected protection from a feared former outlaw seeking redemption from his violent past. This is a story about unwavering faith in the darkest moments and finding grace in the most unlikely places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Silver Creek as the stagecoach finally rattled to a stop after 3 grueling days on mountain roads. 28-year-old Abigail Thornton pressed her fingertips against the smudged window glass, taking in her first glimpse of the frontier town that would become her home. The small settlement nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines, and distant snow-capped peaks appeared both beautiful and intimidating to her eastern eyes. "Silver Creek, end of the line," the driver called, his voice rough from years of shouting over the clatter of hooves and wheels. Abigail smoothed the wrinkles from her modest grey dress, adjusting the simple wooden cross that hung from a thin chain around her neck. Her father's well-worn Bible rested in her lap, its margins filled with his careful notes and observations from years of devoted study. With both parents now gone, taken by the influenza that had swept through their Ohio community last winter, the sacred book represented her most treasured possession and tangible connection to her family's steadfast faith. As she gathered her belongings, one carpet bag containing her clothing and a small wooden trunk holding her few keepsakes, Abigail whispered a quick prayer for courage. The correspondence with Maxwell Grant had been her lifeline during the dark months following her parents' deaths, when the family farm was sold to cover debts and she found herself alone with dwindling prospects. "Lord, guide my path in this new place," she murmured. "Help me to be a good wife and to bring your light wherever you have led me." Maxwell's letters had described a successful mercantile business, a respectable home in need of a woman's touch, and a desire for a sensible, practical woman of good character. His words had been respectful, expressing appreciation for her, candor about her circumstances, and her devotion to her faith. While not overtly religious himself, he had written that he respected her convictions and saw them as evidence of strong moral character. Stepping down from the stagecoach, Abigail's high-buttoned boots sank slightly into the dusty street. She scanned the small crowd of onlookers, searching for the man who matched Maxwell's self-description, tall, with light brown hair, clean-shaven, with a distinguished bearing that set him apart from the typical frontier roughness. "Miss Thornton?" She turned, hope rising in her chest. The man who approached was indeed tall and well-dressed in a tailored suit that seemed incongruous with the rustic surroundings. His hair was the promised light brown, though thinning at the temples, and his clean-shaven face bore the signs of someone who spent more time indoors than working the land. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, assessed her with clinical detachment. "Mr. Grant?" she inquired, extending her gloved hand with a smile. "Maxwell Grant, at your service." He took her hand briefly, the touch formal and perfunctory. "Welcome to Silver Creek. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous." "It was long, but uneventful," Abigail replied, studying his face. Something in his manner felt different from the thoughtful correspondent whose letters she had read repeatedly during her journey west. "I'm pleased to finally meet you in person." Grant's eyes swept over her, taking in her simple dress, the cross at her neck, and the Bible she clutched alongside her carpet bag. A flicker of what might have been disappointment crossed his features. "Yes, well, you're exactly as you described. Yourself in your letters, refreshingly honest." His tone carried an undercurrent that Abigail couldn't quite identify. "I've arranged accommodations for you at the Silver Springs Inn. We'll dine this evening to discuss our arrangements." As they walked toward the modest two-story building that served as the town's only hotel, Abigail became aware of curious glances from townsfolk going about their business. A group of rough-looking men outside the Broken Spur saloon paused their conversation to watch them pass, one of them calling out, "Found yourself another one, eh, Grant?" Maxwell's jaw tightened, but he offered no response to the comment, increasing his pace slightly. Abigail hurried to keep up, confusion beginning to stir within her. "Another one?" she ventured cautiously. "Pay them no mind," Grant replied curtly. "Idle gossip is the primary entertainment in small towns like Silver Creek." The hotel proprietress, Mrs. Whitaker, a stout woman with graying hair and kind eyes, welcomed Abigail warmly as Maxwell made the introductions. "Miss Thornton will be staying with us temporarily," he explained, handing the woman payment. "Please see that she's comfortable. I'll return at 6 for dinner." With a perfunctory nod to Abigail, he departed, leaving her standing awkwardly in the small lobby, her belongings at her feet. "Let me show you to your room, dear," Mrs. Whitaker said gently, picking up Abigail's carpet bag. "You must be exhausted after your journey." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Once alone, Abigail sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak as the reality of her situation settled over her. She was thousands of miles from everything familiar, in a town where she knew no one, about to marry a man who already seemed different from his letters. Opening her father's Bible, Abigail found comfort in the familiar passages. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." The words of Proverbs had guided her through many difficult moments, and she clung to them now. After washing away the dust of travel and changing into her best dress, a navy blue affair with white piping that spoke of Eastern refinement without ostentation, Abigail made her way downstairs at the appointed time. Maxwell waited in the small dining room, already seated at a corner table. He rose as she approached, pulling out her chair with practiced courtesy that seemed mechanical rather than genuine. "You look presentable," he commented as she took her seat, the words more assessment than compliment. "Thank you," Abigail replied, folding her hands in her lap. "Mr. Grant, I hope we might take this opportunity to become better acquainted. Your letters spoke of your business and your home, but I'd like to know more about you personally." Maxwell studied her for a moment before answering. "My personal history is unremarkable. I established my mercantile business 5 years ago, when Silver Creek began to prosper from the silver mines. I've expanded systematically, adding a freight company and investments in several mining operations. Business is my primary focus and passion." "And your family?" Abigail asked. "My parents remained in Boston. I have limited contact with them." His tone discouraged further inquiry on that subject. "Now, Miss Thornton, perhaps you might explain something that has me curious." Abigail nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Your letters mentioned your religious upbringing, but the frequency with which you've referenced your faith since arriving suggests a level of devotion I hadn't anticipated." His gaze dropped pointedly to the cross at her neck. "I'm concerned about what that might mean for our potential arrangement." Before Abigail could respond, a server arrived with their meals: beef stew that proved more gristle than meat, and hard bread that required considerable effort to chew. They ate in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, Abigail's mind racing to understand Maxwell's apparent concern with her faith. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Grant, I've always been forthright about my beliefs. They are central to who I am. But I assure you, I understand the practical aspects of marriage and am fully capable of managing a household, supporting your business interests, and being a proper wife." Maxwell set down his spoon with deliberate care. Yes, well, there's properly religious, and then there's—" He gestured vaguely at her, "excessively devout. I need a practical partner, Miss Thornton, not someone who will spend hours in prayer when there's work to be done, or who will judge business decisions based on scripture rather than profit." Abigail's cheeks flushed with indignation. "Sir, my faith guides my principles, but it has never prevented me from fulfilling my responsibilities. In fact, it strengthens my commitment to hard work and honorable dealings." "Perhaps in Ohio," Maxwell replied dismissively. "The frontier operates by different rules. Business opportunities here require flexibility, compromise. Your letters presented you as sensible and practical. I'm concerned your religious fervor might interfere with what I require in a wife." "And what exactly do you require, Mr. Grant?" Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. Maxwell leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Silver Creek is a growing community, Miss Thornton. I've established myself as its leading businessman, but maintaining that position requires a certain image. I need a wife who enhances my standing, who understands discretion, and who won't question my methods or impose restrictive moral judgments on necessary business practices." The meaning behind his carefully chosen words became increasingly clear. Maxwell Grant wasn't seeking a partner who shared his values. He wanted someone who would turn a blind eye to whatever questionable dealings had built his success. "I see," Abigail said quietly. "Then I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding between us." "Perhaps," Maxwell admitted with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But consider your situation carefully before making hasty decisions. You've traveled a considerable distance at significant expense. Ohio is a long journey back, especially for a woman in your circumstances, alone with limited funds. Few respectable options await you here or elsewhere." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Accept his terms or face destitution in a town where she knew no one. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I will not compromise my principles, Mr. Grant, regardless of my circumstances," Abigail stated, rising from the table with dignity despite her trembling hands. "Good evening." As she turned to leave, Maxwell's voice followed her, low and threatening. "Consider carefully, Miss Thornton. Silver Creek can be quite inhospitable to women without protection or purpose." Abigail maintained her composure until she reached her room, where she sank onto the bed, the full weight of her situation crashing down upon her. She was stranded in an unfamiliar frontier town, her savings depleted by the journey west, with no immediate prospects and no one to turn to. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she allowed herself to weep, tears flowing freely as she clutched her father's Bible. "Why have you brought me here, Lord?" she whispered into the growing darkness. "What purpose could this serve?" Eventually her tears subsided, replaced by the quiet determination that had sustained her through previous hardships. She would not allow despair to overcome her faith. There must be a path forward, even if she couldn't yet see it. A gentle knock at her door startled her from her prayers. Mrs. Whittaker stood in the hallway, concern evident in her kind eyes. "I thought you might appreciate some tea, dear," the older woman said, offering a steaming cup. "The first night in a strange place is always difficult." Abigail accepted the tea gratefully, inviting Mrs. Whittaker to sit. The innkeeper hesitated only briefly before settling into the room's single chair. "I couldn't help but notice your dinner with Mr. Grant ended." Abruptly, Mrs. Whittaker ventured carefully. "Mr. Grant and I discovered we have incompatible expectations," Abigail replied diplomatically, sipping the soothing chamomile tea. Mrs. Whittaker nodded, unsurprised. "You're not the first, you know. There have been others, at least two that I'm aware of. young women who arrived by stagecoach full of hope, only to depart shortly after meeting Maxwell Grant. "What happened to them?" Abigail asked, a chill running through her. The first left immediately, apparently having family in Denver who could assist her. The second, Mrs. Whittaker's expression darkened. She had nowhere to go and insufficient funds to leave. She eventually took work at the Broken Spur, not as a barmaid, mind you, but the innkeeper didn't need to finish her sentence for Abigail to understand. "I see," Abigail said quietly, her stomach tightening with fear. "How are you situated, dear? Financially, I mean." Abigail hesitated, reluctant to reveal her vulnerability, but recognizing that she needed guidance. "I have enough for perhaps 10 days' lodging. The journey west was expensive." Mrs. Whittaker's face creased with concern. "And do you have family who might send assistance?" "No one," Abigail admitted. "My parents passed last winter. I have distant relatives in Cincinnati, but we're not close." She straightened her shoulders, determined not to appear pitiful. "I'm willing to work, Mrs. Whittaker. I'm skilled with a needle. I made all my own clothing. I can cook, keep accounts, and I've taught children in our church Sunday school." Mrs. Whittaker considered this information thoughtfully. Silver Creek isn't Boston or even Cincinnati. There's no proper dressmaker, though folks might appreciate quality mending. The mining company has an office that occasionally needs clerical help, but they typically hire men. She paused, thinking. The school is seeking a teacher, but the position doesn't start until autumn, nearly 2 months away. Hope flickered briefly in Abigail's chest. A teaching position would be ideal. "I know the school board chairman," Mrs. Whittaker offered. "I could arrange an introduction. In the meantime—" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to suggest. "I could use help here at the inn. It wouldn't pay much, just room and board, but it would give you time to secure something more suitable." Tears of gratitude welled in Abigail's eyes. "That's incredibly kind, Mrs. Whittaker." "Not kindness, practicality," the older woman replied briskly, though her eyes remained gentle. "I'm not as young as I once was, and good help is scarce in Silver Creek. Most able-bodied women are already married, and the few single ladies are either spoken for or—" She glanced toward the direction of the saloon. "Otherwise employed." They agreed that Abigail would help with cleaning rooms, serving breakfast to guests, and managing the front desk during Mrs. Whittaker's errands. The arrangement wouldn't advance her financial situation, but it would prevent it from deteriorating further while she sought more permanent employment. As Mrs. Whittaker rose to leave, she hesitated at the door. "One more thing, Miss Thornton. Be careful around Maxwell Grant. He doesn't take rejection well, especially when it challenges his self-image. He has significant influence in Silver Creek, owns the mercantile, has interests in the mines, holds notes on half the businesses in town. People who cross him often find themselves facing difficulties." The warning sent a chill through Abigail, but she nodded her understanding. "Thank you for your candor, Mrs. Whittaker, and please, call me Abigail." "Ruth," the innkeeper replied, with a warm smile. "Rest well, Abigail. Things often appear brighter in the morning light." Despite Ruth's encouraging words, Abigail's first full day in Silver Creek brought its own challenges. Word had already spread about her rejection of Maxwell Grant's proposal, resulting in curious stares and whispered comments as she went about her new duties at the inn. Shortly before noon, the bell above the door jingled, and Abigail looked up from the ledger she was organizing to find Maxwell himself standing in the lobby, his expression coolly calculating. "Miss Thornton," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "I see you've found employment. How resourceful." "Mr. Grant," Abigail replied, keeping her voice level. "Mrs. Whittaker has kindly offered me a position while I establish myself in Silver Creek." Maxwell's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, though I wonder if you've fully considered the implications of your decision. Silver Creek can be quite unwelcoming to outsiders who don't adapt to local customs. I've always found that honest work and sincere faith provide sufficient foundation regardless of location, Abigail responded, refusing to be intimidated. Faith, Maxwell repeated, the word dripping with disdain. A luxury in frontier towns, Miss Thornton, not a practical asset. Out here, connections and influence determine one's prospects. He leaned slightly over the counter, lowering his voice. Should you reconsider our arrangement, the offer remains open. Temporarily. Before Abigail could respond, the door opened. Again, admitting a tall figure whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the small lobby. The newcomer was rugged in appearance, with dark hair streaked prematurely with silver at the temples, and a face weathered by sun and hardship. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to his jawline, giving his otherwise handsome features an intimidating asymmetry. Most striking were his eyes, a deep, penetrating blue that seemed to assess everything they fell upon with careful calculation. Maxwell straightened immediately, his demeanor shifting from threatening to cautiously respectful. "Sullivan," he acknowledged stiffly. "Grant," the man returned, his voice a low rumble that matched his imposing presence. His gaze moved briefly to Abigail before returning to Maxwell. "Not interrupting business, am I?" "Not at all," Maxwell replied, the careful cordiality in his tone betraying underlying tension. "Just welcoming our newest resident to Silver Creek. Miss Thornton, this is Jasper Sullivan. He owns the property north of town." His emphasis on the word owns carried an undercurrent Abigail couldn't quite decipher. Sullivan nodded politely to Abigail, but offered no pleasantries, his attention remaining fixed on Maxwell. "Need to discuss that freight issue, Grant. Your shipment came through my property again without permission." Maxwell's smile tightened. "A simple misunderstanding, I'm sure. The new route sometimes confuses my drivers." "Third misunderstanding this month," Sullivan countered flatly. "Won't be a fourth." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Maxwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should discuss this in my office." "Perhaps we should," Sullivan agreed, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. With a curt nod to Abigail, Maxwell departed, Sullivan following a few paces behind, his tall frame filling the doorway momentarily before both. Men disappeared down the street toward the Mercantile. "I see you've met our local enigma," Ruth commented, emerging from the back room, where she had clearly been listening to the exchange. "Mr. Sullivan?" Abigail asked, intrigued despite herself by the strange tension between the two men. Ruth nodded, lowering her voice though they were alone in the lobby. "Jasper Sullivan arrived in Silver Creek about 3 years ago, bought the old McAllister Ranch north of town, paid cash, which started rumors immediately. Keeps to himself mostly, runs a modest cattle operation with just a few hired hands. Not unfriendly, but private. He and Mr. Grant seem to have a strained relationship," Abigail observed. Ruth's expression grew serious. "Grant has been trying to acquire Sullivan's land since he arrived. It controls the most direct route between the mines and the railroad. Sullivan won't sell at any price, which frustrates Grant to no end." She hesitated, then added, "There are rumors about Sullivan's past, that he rode with Carlton's gang years ago, before they were caught robbing trains in Colorado. An outlaw?" Abigail whispered, startled. "Former outlaw, if the rumors are true," Ruth corrected. "No one knows for certain. He's never been arrested here, pays his taxes promptly, and deals fairly with those who work for him. But there's something in his manner, a wariness, a capacity for violence carefully contained, that lends credence to the stories." This revelation troubled Abigail, who had been raised to respect the law and view its breaking as a moral failing. Yet she couldn't reconcile the rumors of violent criminality with the man who had just stood in the lobby, intimidating certainly, but also possessed of a dignity that seemed at odds with her understanding of outlaws. Best not to dwell on rumors, Ruth advised, noticing Abigail's discomfort. In frontier towns, everyone has a past they're trying to outrun or reinvent. Judge a man by his actions here and now, that's my philosophy. As Abigail continued her duties that afternoon, her mind kept returning to the brief encounter. Maxwell Grant, with his veneer of civilization barely concealing threatening undercurrents, and Jasper Sullivan, with his scarred face and reputation for violence, yet a directness that suggested a different kind of honor. She had come west expecting clarity, a straightforward path as a respected businessman's wife. Instead, she found herself adrift in a town where appearances seemed consistently at odds with reality, where a man of good standing could threaten a vulnerable woman while a rumored outlaw confronted him over principles of property rights. That evening, Abigail sat by her window watching as Silver Creek transformed in the fading light. The rough mining town took on a strange beauty as lanterns were lit and the distant mountains turned purple against the darkening sky. Opening her Bible, she sought comfort in familiar passages. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read softly to herself. "I shall not want." The words had never seemed simultaneously so comforting and so challenging. She had wanted for nothing in Ohio, secure, in her parents' home and her community's embrace. Now, alone in this frontier town with uncertain prospects, the promise required a deeper faith, trust that even here, in this unfamiliar wilderness, she was guided by a divine purpose she couldn't yet discern. The following days established a rhythm for Abigail at the Silver Creek Inn. She rose early, prepared breakfast for the guests, cleaned rooms, and managed the front desk while Ruth handled errands and supplies. The work was honest, if not particularly challenging, and Abigail found comfort in the routine as she adjusted to her new reality. True to her word, Ruth arranged an introduction to William Patterson, the balding, bespectacled chairman of the Silver Creek School Board. He interviewed Abigail in the inn's small dining room, his questions thorough but fair regarding her educational background and teaching experience. "Your qualifications are sound, Miss Thornton," Patterson concluded, adjusting his spectacles. "We've struggled to retain teachers here. Most young women either marry quickly or find the frontier too challenging. Your maturity might be an advantage." He hesitated, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "However, there's the matter of Mr. Grant." "What does Mr. Grant have to do with the teaching position?" Abigail asked. Though she feared she already knew the answer, Patterson shifted in his seat. "Mr. Grant sits on the school board. More importantly, he donated the land for the schoolhouse and contributes significantly to the teacher's salary. His opinion carries considerable weight." "And you believe he would oppose my appointment because I declined his proposal," Abigail concluded, keeping her voice steady despite her disappointment. "It's a small town, Miss Thornton. People talk. Mr. Grant has suggested you might not be suitable for molding young minds due to your—" He paused, searching for the appropriate words. "Excessive religious fervor." The irony was not lost on Abigail. That devotion to faith would be considered a disqualification for teaching, while the vindictiveness of a spurned suitor would not. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I would ask you to consider my application on its merits, Mr. Patterson. Judge me by my capabilities and character, not by Mr. Grant's wounded pride." Patterson appeared uncomfortable, but not unsympathetic. "The board meets at the end of the month. I'll present your application fairly, but I can't make promises." After he left, Abigail retreated to the kitchen, fighting both anger and despair. Maxwell Grant's influence seemed to reach into every corner of Silver Creek, restricting her options and potentially condemning her to permanent dependency on Ruth's generosity. As she aggressively kneaded dough for the next morning's bread, venting her frustration into the innocent flour, the back door opened. A young woman entered, perhaps 20 years old, with auburn hair escaping a hasty bun and a faded calico dress that had seen better days. Her arms were laden with neatly folded linens. "Mrs. Whitaker said to bring these around back," she explained, setting the bundle on the kitchen table. "Fresh from washing." "Thank you," Abigail replied, wiping flour from her hands. "I'm Abigail Thornton, Mrs. Whitaker's new assistant." "Sarah Jenkins," the young woman offered with a shy smile. "My pa runs the livery stable. I help with washing for some of the businesses in town." She glanced at the dough Abigail had been punishing. "That bread looks like it might fight back." Abigail laughed, despite herself. "I may have been working out some frustrations." "About Mr. Grant?" Sarah asked perceptively. When Abigail's eyes widened in surprise, Sarah shrugged. "Like I said, I handle washing for half the town. People talk freely around someone they don't really see." An idea formed in Abigail's mind. What else do people say when they don't think anyone's listening? Sarah proved to be a wealth of information about Silver Creek's residents and their interconnected lives. Over cups of tea at the kitchen table, she shared insights that would have taken Abigail months to gather on her own. Mr. Grant arrived about 4 years ago, right after the big silver strike, Sarah explained. Had money to invest when most folks were still scrambling. Bought the mercantile from old Mr. Finch, who wanted to retire, then started lending to miners who needed equipment. When they couldn't repay, he'd take claims as payment. "That seems predatory," Abigail observed. "That's business on the frontier," Sarah replied with the pragmatism of someone who had never known any other system. "But it's not just that. There's something off about how quickly his businesses expanded. Some mines that wouldn't sell to him had mysterious cave-ins. Competitors faced supply problems that somehow never affected Grant's operations. And no one challenges him? Sheriff Miller is more interested in his whiskey than law enforcement, and Judge Perkins only comes through every 3 months. Besides, nothing can ever be proven, just a series of unfortunate coincidences that benefit Maxwell Grant." Sarah's revelations painted a disturbing picture of the man Abigail had nearly married, not merely unscrupulous in business, but potentially dangerous to those who opposed him. "What about Mr. Sullivan?" Abigail asked, recalling the tension she had witnessed between the two men. Sarah's expression grew more guarded. "Jasper Sullivan keeps to himself, but he's fair. Pays cash for feed and supplies, treats his horses well, which matters to Pa and doesn't cause trouble unless provoked. Some say he has a violent past, but," she shrugged, "who doesn't out here?" Their conversation was interrupted by Ruth's return, but before Sarah departed, she squeezed Abigail's hand. "If you need anything, my family's place is just behind. The livery. Ma always makes too much stew on Sundays. You'd be welcome." This simple offering of friendship lightened Abigail's spirits considerably. Perhaps Silver Creek wasn't as hostile to newcomers as Maxwell had implied, at least not to those he didn't actively work against. The following Sunday morning, Abigail dressed in her best remaining outfit, a modest blue dress with white collar, and prepared to find the local church. She had noticed a small white-painted building with a modest steeple at the edge of town, but hadn't yet had the opportunity to attend services. "You're determined to go, then?" Ruth asked as Abigail pinned her hair neatly at the breakfast table. "Of course," Abigail replied, surprised by the question. "It's the Sabbath." Ruth's expression was troubled. "You should know Reverend Thomas is friendly with Mr. Grant. The church was built largely with Grant's donations, and the Reverend's salary depends significantly on his continued generosity." Abigail felt a fresh wave of disappointment. Even her worship would be complicated by Maxwell's influence. Still, her faith had always been her anchor, and she wouldn't abandon it now. "Nevertheless, I must attend," she said firmly. "I won't hide my devotion because it makes Mr. Grant uncomfortable." The small church was already filling when Abigail arrived, families in their Sunday best settling into rough-hewn pews. She noticed several curious glances as she entered. but also a few friendly nods, including one from Sarah Jenkins, who sat with an older couple Abigail assumed were her parents. Abigail slipped into a back pew, hoping to observe quietly, but her presence had already been noted. Reverend Thomas, a thin man with an overly earnest expression, paused in his preparations at the pulpit, his gaze lingering on her with obvious recognition. Maxwell must have described her in detail. The service proceeded conventionally enough, with familiar hymns and readings, though Abigail noted the sermon focused heavily on obedience to authority and accepting one's proper place in the social order, themes that seemed suspiciously aligned with Maxwell Grant's worldview rather than scriptural foundations. As the congregation filed out after the benediction, Reverend Thomas intercepted Abigail before she could exit. "Miss Thornton, welcome to our humble church," he greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand you're staying at Mrs. Whitaker's establishment." "Yes, Reverend. I've taken a position there while I establish myself in Silver Creek." "How admirable," he replied, his tone suggesting the opposite. "Though I was under the impression you had come to town with other arrangements in mind." "God's plans often differ from our own," Abigail replied evenly. The Reverend's smile tightened. "Indeed, though sometimes what we perceive as divine guidance is merely our own willfulness disguised as piety." He lowered his voice slightly. "Mr. Grant is a generous benefactor to this community, Miss Thornton. His contributions have built much of what you see around you, including this very church. Those who oppose him often find themselves isolated." The warning was clear, wrapped though it was in pastoral concern. Before Abigail could respond, a deep voice intervened from behind her. "Morning, Reverend. Sermon was shorter than usual today." Abigail turned to find Jasper Sullivan standing there, his imposing presence somehow more striking in clean Sunday attire than it had been in working clothes. His scarred face was freshly shaved, his dark hair neatly combed, though nothing could soften the intensity of those penetrating blue eyes. Reverend Thomas's demeanor shifted immediately, the implied threat replaced by nervous deference. "Mr. Sullivan, I wasn't expecting you today. You usually attend the evening service, if at all." "Felt the need for morning worship," Sullivan replied mildly, though something in his tone suggested his appearance was no coincidence. "Miss Thornton, isn't it? We weren't properly introduced at the inn." "Yes, Mr. Sullivan, Abigail Thornton. Pleasure," he said with a slight nod. "Heading back to town? Road can be dusty for a lady walking alone." The offer of escort was clear, as was Sullivan's intention to interrupt whatever pressure the Reverend had been applying. Abigail found herself both grateful for the intervention and wary of its implications. "That's very kind, Mr. Sullivan," she replied carefully. Reverend Thomas watched this exchange with poorly concealed concern. "Miss Thornton, perhaps you'd prefer to join the Pattersons for the walk back. William mentioned he'd spoken with you about the teaching position." "I believe the Pattersons have already departed," Sullivan observed, nodding toward the empty churchyard. "And it appears Miss Thornton has made her choice." There was a subtle emphasis on the word choice that wasn't lost on either Abigail or the Reverend. Without waiting for further objection, Sullivan offered his arm, which Abigail hesitantly accepted. They walked in silence until the church was well behind them, the dusty road stretching ahead toward town. Finally Sullivan spoke. "Grant's reach extends farther than you might have expected." It wasn't a question, but Abigail answered anyway. "Yes, the school board, the church. He seems to have influence everywhere." "Not everywhere," Sullivan corrected, his voice carrying a hint of steel beneath its calm surface. "Some of us remember what it means to stand our ground." Abigail studied his profile, the jagged scar stark against his tanned skin. "Mrs. Whitaker mentioned you've refused to sell your land to Mr. Grant." A ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's lips. "Among other refusals." "May I ask why you intervened back there?" Abigail questioned directly. "You hardly know me." Sullivan considered her question for several paces before answering. "I recognize Grant's tactics. He isolates those who oppose him, turns the community against them until they either leave or surrender to his terms." He glanced at her. "Your faith makes you a particular target. It represents a standard he can't corrupt or intimidate." His insight startled her. "You seem to understand him well." "I understand men like him," Sullivan replied grimly. "Men who believe power gives them the right to demand compliance from others, who mistake fear for respect." They had reached the edge of town, where Sunday stillness had settled over the usually bustling main street. Sullivan stopped, turning to face her directly. "Silver Creek isn't just Grant's domain, Miss Thornton, whatever he might have told you. There are good people here, the Jenkins family, Doc Wilson, even old Ruth Whitaker, people who make their own judgments rather than following Grant's lead." He paused, then added quietly, "You should know you're not without allies." With that, he tipped his hat and turned toward the livery stables, leaving Abigail to contemplate this unexpected show of support from a man rumored to have a violent past. As she continued toward the inn, she realized that Silver Creek was far more complex than she had initially understood. A community divided not simply between Maxwell Grant's supporters and opponents, but between those who surrendered their judgment to power and those who maintained their independence despite the cost. And perhaps, she thought with newfound hope, there were enough of the latter to create a place where she might truly belong. Despite Maxwell Grant's determination to drive her away, the following week brought subtle but unmistakable changes to Abigail's situation in Silver Creek. Regular customers at the inn suddenly found reasons to stay elsewhere. The mercantile clerk refused to sell supplies to Ruth unless she paid significantly above the usual price. Even Sarah's family received a warning that their laundry services would no longer be needed at establishments owned by Grant's business associates if they continued associating with the religious spinster. "He's turning the town against you," Ruth observed grimly as she reviewed the inn's dwindling reservations. "Slowly, methodically, just as he's done with others who opposed him." "Not the entire town," Abigail corrected, thinking of the Jenkins family who had indeed welcomed her for Sunday supper despite the warnings, and of Jasper Sullivan's unexpected alliance. "Just those dependent on his goodwill, which is most of Silver Creek," Ruth sighed, closing the ledger. "I can weather this storm. I own this building outright and have enough saved to get by with fewer guests. But I worry about you, dear." The school board meets tomorrow, and William Patterson looked positively miserable when he passed by this morning, avoiding eye contact entirely. Abigail had been preparing herself for disappointment regarding the teaching position, but the reality still stung. "Then I'll find another way to contribute. Perhaps private lessons for children whose parents value education over Mr. Grant's approval." Ruth patted her hand affectionately. "Your spirit is admirable, Abigail. Just be careful not to mistake stubbornness for faith." Later that afternoon, as Abigail swept the inn's front porch, a weathered wagon pulled by 2 tired horses stopped. In front, the driver, an elderly man with a snow-white beard and shrewd eyes, studied her with undisguised curiosity. "You'd be Miss Thornton, I reckon," he called in a voice roughened by years and tobacco. "The God-fearing lady who told Maxwell Grant where to step." Abigail leaned on her broom, assessing the stranger. "I'm Abigail Thornton, yes. And you are?" "Samuel Harker," he replied, climbing down stiffly from the wagon seat. "Most folks call me Doc, though I ain't got formal papers. Set more bones and delivered more babies in this territory than any college man." He approached the porch, extending a gnarled hand. "Came to town for supplies, heard there was a lady with medical knowledge helping out at the inn." "Medical knowledge?" Abigail echoed, confused. I have some experience with home remedies, but nothing that would merit. Sarah Jenkins says you fixed her ma's headache powder when the mercantile started watering it down," Doc interrupted. "Says you knew just which herbs to add from Ruth's garden. Says you also bandaged the Cooper boy's arm proper when he fell from the loft." Abigail had indeed helped in both instances, applying knowledge gained from her mother's herbal manual and years of assisting with minor injuries at home, but hardly considered these actions noteworthy. "Simple kindnesses, nothing more," she demurred. Doc Harker's weathered face creased in a grin. "Kindness is rarer than skill in these parts, Miss Thornton, and from what I hear you got both." He gestured toward his wagon. "Got a proposition for you. My eyes ain't what they used to be, and my hands shake something fierce in the mornings. Been looking for someone with a steady hand and quick mind to help sort my medicines, maybe assist with simpler cases." The unexpected offer caught Abigail by surprise. "I'm not qualified. You're qualified enough to learn," Doc cut in. "I'm not asking you to perform surgery, just help organize what's become a mess and maybe lend a hand when needed. Pay wouldn't be much. Folks often settle with eggs or fresh meat instead of cash, but it's honest work away from Grant's immediate influence." Abigail glanced toward the mercantile, where she could see Maxwell Grant himself, standing in the doorway, watching their interaction with narrow-eyed displeasure. "When would you need my assistance?" she asked, making her decision. "Tuesdays and Thursdays to start," Doc replied. "My place is about 2 miles outside town, near the creek crossing. Can arrange transport if needed." They settled the details quickly, and as Doc prepared to leave, he lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Sullivan suggested I might find you suitable. By the way, man doesn't make recommendations lightly." This revelation that Jasper Sullivan had actively sought to help her secure employment both warmed and puzzled Abigail. Their brief interactions hardly seemed sufficient to prompt such support, yet he had apparently gone out of his way to create an opportunity for her. That evening, as she helped Ruth prepare dinner, Abigail shared the development. The older woman seemed relieved but cautious. Doc Harker's respected, even by those loyal to Grant. His services are too valuable for anyone to boycott, no matter who he employs. She chopped vegetables with vigorous precision. "Still, the journey to his place is isolated. Be wary." The wisdom of Ruth's warning became apparent the next morning. Abigail had just finished serving breakfast to the inn's few remaining guests when Sheriff Miller entered, his thumbs hooked in his belt loops and his expression pompous with official authority. "Miss Thornton," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "need to speak with you regarding complaints about your activities in Silver Creek." Abigail straightened, conscious of the watching eyes. "What complaints would those be, Sheriff?" "Practicing medicine without proper licensing, for one," Miller replied, producing a sheet of paper from his vest pocket. "Got a formal statement. Hear about you distributing herbal remedies without authorization." Ruth emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's ridiculous, Thomas, and you know it. Helping Sarah Jenkins' mother with a headache remedy hardly constitutes practicing medicine." The sheriff avoided Ruth's direct gaze. "Law's the law, Mrs. Whitaker. Can't have just anyone handing out treatments. Doc Harker's the only one authorized in these parts." "Then perhaps you should speak with Doc Harker," Abigail suggested calmly, "as he's just offered me a position as his assistant, with his full authorization to help prepare remedies under his supervision." This information clearly caught the sheriff off guard. He fumbled with the paper, uncertainty replacing his officious demeanor. "Well, that would be different, I suppose. Still, there's the matter of your boarding situation." "My boarding situation," Abigail echoed, genuinely confused. Miller cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Town ordinance prohibits unmarried women from residing in establishments without proper chaperonage. Mrs. Whitaker living alone doesn't constitute adequate supervision, according to the letter of the law." Ruth's face flushed with indignation. That ordinance was intended for saloon girls, Thomas, not respectable boarding houses. It hasn't been enforced in 15 years. Complaints have been filed, Miller insisted stubbornly. I'm obliged to investigate. Miss Thornton should make arrangements to relocate to a more suitable living situation within the week. The purpose of this sudden enforcement became painfully clear. With no suitable alternative accommodations in Silver Creek, Abigail would be forced to leave town entirely or reconsider Maxwell Grant's proposition. Before Abigail could formulate a response, the inn's door opened once more. Jasper Sullivan entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His timing was so fortuitous that Abigail wondered if he had been watching the sheriff's movements. "Morning, Sheriff," Sullivan greeted mildly, though his eyes were sharp. "Heard you were reviewing outdated ordinances. Found something interesting myself recently. Town statute from '62 prohibiting law enforcement from harassing citizens based on complaints without substantiated evidence." He produced a folded, yellowed paper from his pocket. Judge Perkins confirmed it's still valid when he passed through last month. Sheriff Miller's face reddened. "Now, see here, Sullivan. Also mention," Sullivan continued as if Miller hadn't spoken, "that selective enforcement of obsolete regulations could constitute misuse of office, potentially a matter for territorial authorities to review." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Miller's bluster deflated visibly as he realized his position had weakened. "Just doing my duty," he muttered, tucking the complaint paper back into his pocket. "Of course," Sullivan agreed pleasantly. "As we all should. Good day, Sheriff." Miller departed with as much dignity as he could muster, though the hasty retreat fooled no one. Once he was gone, Sullivan turned to Abigail with a grim expression. "Grant's escalating his efforts," he observed. "Using official channels now." "Thank you for your intervention," Abigail said sincerely, "though I wonder how you knew to appear at precisely the right moment." A ghost of a smile crossed Sullivan's scarred face. "Small town. News travels," Ruth snorted skeptically. "More likely, you've been keeping an eye on Miller's movements." She studied Sullivan with newfound curiosity. "You seem particularly invested in Miss Thornton's welfare, Mr. Sullivan." Sullivan met the innkeeper's pointed gaze steadily. "I dislike bullies, Mrs. Whitaker. Always have." "Is that what got you that scar?" Ruth pressed, gesturing to his face. "Among other things," he replied without elaboration. To Abigail, he added, "Doc Harker mentioned he spoke with you. Good man, honest, been patching me up for years without asking questions I don't want to answer." "I start tomorrow," Abigail confirmed, "though Sheriff Miller's visit suggests Mr. Grant doesn't approve of the arrangement. Grant doesn't own Doc, and he doesn't own you," Sullivan stated flatly. Then, after a brief hesitation, he added, "I'm heading that direction tomorrow. Could provide transportation if you're amenable." The offer, practical though it was, carried implications that made Abigail pause. Accepting Sullivan's assistance too openly might fuel town gossip, yet the 2-mile journey alone suddenly seemed more precarious given the morning's events. "That's very kind," she replied carefully, "though I wouldn't want to inconvenience you." "No inconvenience," Sullivan assured her. "Need supplies from that area anyway." As he departed, tipping his hat to both women, Ruth gave Abigail a meaningful look. "That man has taken a particular interest in your situation." "He opposes Mr. Grant," Abigail replied, attempting to sound matter-of-fact. "That gives us common cause, nothing more." Ruth's knowing smile suggested she wasn't convinced. "Common cause indeed. Just remember, Abigail, a man with Jasper Sullivan's past doesn't involve himself in other people's troubles without reason. His opposition to Grant may be only part of his motivation." That night, as Silver Creek settled into darkness, Abigail found herself unable to sleep, her mind cycling through the day's events. Maxwell Grant's campaign against her had progressed from economic pressure to legal harassment, with more, surely, to come. Yet even as opposition mounted, unexpected allies had emerged, most puzzling among them the enigmatic Jasper Sullivan. What had Ruth said? A man with his past doesn't involve himself without reason. The question that kept Abigail awake wasn't whether she could trust Sullivan's assistance. She already did, instinctively, but why he offered it. What did a former outlaw with a carefully guarded past see in her that prompted such consistent protection? Perhaps, she reflected as she finally drifted towards sleep, it wasn't what he saw in her at all, but what he recognized in Maxwell Grant, a familiar kind of evil that he was uniquely positioned to combat. Abigail's work with Doc Harker quickly became the highlight of her week. Twice weekly, Jasper Sullivan would arrive promptly at dawn with his wagon, speaking little during the journey to the doctor's cabin, but providing a reassuring presence as they traveled the isolated road. Doc's practice consisted of a weathered, two-room cabin filled with an astonishing array of medical supplies, herbal remedies, and handwritten journals documenting treatments for everything from mining injuries to childbirth complications. As promised, Abigail's initial role involved organizing this chaos into a functional system, labeling medicines, categorizing supplies, and transcribing the doctor's nearly illegible notes into clear records. "You've got a gift for order, Doc," observed approvingly as Abigail implemented a color-coded system for his various remedies. And a steady hand with those mixtures. Her responsibilities expanded naturally as Doc recognized her capabilities. Soon she was preparing basic remedies under his supervision, assisting with minor treatments, and even handling some routine cases independently while he rested his arthritic joints. "Your mother taught you well," he commented when Abigail correctly identified the right herb combination for a miner's respiratory ailment. "She believed in practical faith," Abigail explained, measuring tinctures with precision. "That serving others through healing was a form of devotion. She'd say, 'God gave us plants for medicine and minds to understand them, using both honors the gift.'" Doc's weathered face creased in a smile. "Wise woman. Shame Grant can't see the value in such practical spirituality." 3 weeks into this new arrangement, as Abigail was completing her day's work at the cabin, Sullivan arrived earlier than usual for their return journey, his expression grave. "Need to head back now," he announced from the doorway. "Storm's coming." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, unusual for the season and promising violent weather. They quickly secured Doc's supplies and departed, the wagon moving at a faster pace than their typical leisurely return. "Something wrong beyond the weather?" Abigail asked, noticing the tension in Sullivan's posture as he handled the reins. His jaw tightened. "Miners came by my place this morning while I was mending fences, looking for work, they claimed, but asked peculiar questions about my schedule when I'd be away from the ranch." "You think they were sent by Mr. Grant?" "No, they were," Sullivan replied grimly. "Recognized one from the mercantile stockroom. Grant's gathering information, planning something." He glanced at the darkening sky. "This storm might work to his advantage. Town's attention will be elsewhere." They were nearly halfway back to Silver Creek when the first heavy raindrops began to fall, quickly intensifying into a downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet ahead. The normally dry creek bed beside the road swelled with alarming speed. As runoff poured from the surrounding hills, Sullivan urged the horses forward, attempting to reach higher ground before the road became impassable. They had just crested a small rise when a jagged bolt of lightning struck a tree directly ahead, sending it crashing across their path. The horses reared in panic, nearly overturning the wagon before Sullivan brought them under control. "We can't continue this way," he shouted over the storm's fury, rain plastering his dark hair against his scarred face. "Creek's rising too fast. We'll have to take shelter and wait it out." Through the curtain of rain, Abigail could just make out a small, Structure, perhaps 100 yards from the road, an abandoned line shack used by cowboys during cattle drives. "There," she pointed, and Sullivan nodded, guiding the frightened horses carefully off the road toward the shelter. The shack was primitive but sound, its roof intact enough to provide relief from the relentless downpour. Sullivan tended to the horses, securing them under the small lean-to attached to the rear, while Abigail assessed their temporary refuge. A rough wooden table, 2 rickety chairs, and a small iron stove were the only furnishings. Surprisingly, a stack of dry firewood remained in the corner, left by previous occupants. "We're fortunate," she commented as Sullivan entered, water streaming from his coat. "There's wood for a fire." Sullivan nodded, immediately setting about building a small blaze in the stove to combat the damp chill. Once the flames caught, casting flickering light throughout the single room, an awkward awareness settled between them as they recognized their predicament, stranded together, alone for what might be hours. "Mrs. Whitaker will worry," Abigail said, breaking the silence as she removed her sodden shawl. "She's a practical woman," Sullivan replied, removing his wet coat but keeping a respectable distance. "She'll understand the necessity." The unspoken concern hung between them. What others in Silver Creek might say was another matter entirely. A young, unmarried woman spending hours alone with a man of Sullivan's reputation would fuel gossip for months, potentially destroying what remained. Of Abigail's standing in the community, as if reading her thoughts, Sullivan spoke quietly. "Your reputation matters to you. It wasn't a question," but Abigail answered anyway. "Not for its own sake, but as a reflection of my character and faith. If people believe I've compromised my principles—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express the complex interplay between personal conviction and public perception. Sullivan's piercing blue eyes studied her face in the dim light. "Yet you continue to defy Grant, knowing he'll twist every action to discredit you." "There are worse things than gossip, Mr. Sullivan. Betraying one's conscience chief among them." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Jasper," he said unexpectedly, "after sharing a lightning storm and potential scandal, you might as well use my given name." This small intimacy, the first he had offered, shifted something in the atmosphere between them. Abigail found herself studying his face more openly, noting how the firelight softened the jagged scar that ran along his jawline. "How did you get it?" she asked softly, gesturing to the mark. "If you don't mind my asking." Sullivan, Jasper, was silent for so long that Abigail thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Prison guard, Denver Territorial, 8 years ago. I'd been sentenced to 15 years for a train robbery with Carlton's gang." He met her gaze directly, unflinching. "I was guilty of that. Oh, crime and others. The guard took exception to something I said, made an example of me with a makeshift blade, nearly died from the infection that followed." The frank admission of his criminal past stunned Abigail, not because she hadn't suspected the truth of the rumors, but because of his willingness to share it openly, without mitigation or excuse. "Yet you're here, not in prison," she observed, keeping her voice neutral. "There was a fire," Jasper continued, his expression distant with memory. "Spread through the cell block fast. Guards panicked, abandoned their posts. I broke out, but went back for others trapped in their cells. Governor issued a conditional pardon afterward for those who helped save lives. Reduced sentences, probation." He glanced at the cross hanging from her neck. "Some might call it divine intervention. I called it opportunity. To start over," Abigail suggested. "To live differently," he corrected. "Can't erase the past, only choose a different path forward." The revelation of his history explained much about Jasper's opposition to Maxwell Grant. A reformed outlaw would recognize the calculated criminality behind Grant's respectable facade. Yet it didn't explain his specific interest in protecting Abigail. "Why have you helped me?" she asked directly. "From the first day at the church, you've intervened repeatedly on my behalf. Why?" Jasper stared into the fire, considering his answer. Carefully. "Your first Sunday in town, I was riding past when Grant confronted you after services, overheard him threatening you, saw how you stood your ground despite having everything to lose." His voice softened. "Reminded me of someone." "Who?" Abigail prompted, when he didn't continue. "Prison chaplain," Jasper replied, surprising her. "Only person who saw something worth saving in me. Man of genuine faith who lived his beliefs rather than just preaching them. He offered guidance without judgment, challenged without condemnation." Jasper met her eyes directly. "When I saw how Grant targeted you for your faith, how you refused to compromise despite the cost, I recognized the same quality, the comparison." To someone who had profoundly influenced Jasper's life, touched Abigail deeply. Before she could respond, however, the door to the line shack burst open, blown by a violent gust that nearly extinguished their fire. With the wind came 3 drenched figures, their sudden appearance so startling that Jasper immediately moved to place himself between them and Abigail. "Well, what have we here?" said the foremost intruder, water streaming from his hat as he surveyed the scene with malicious amusement. Sullivan and the Holy Mail Order bride, all cozy and private. Abigail recognized him as one of the men who had been watching them from outside the Broken Spur saloon when she first arrived in Silver Creek. The other 2 were miners she had seen at the Mercantile, confirming Jasper's suspicion that they worked for Grant. "Martin," Jasper acknowledged the speaker flatly. "Bad night to be out. Storm catch you by surprise?" Martin's grin was wolfish. "No surprise at all. Been waiting for you to pass this way." He glanced at his companions. "Mr. Grant was right. Said if we watched the road to Doc's place on Thursday, we'd catch you 2 together eventually." The deliberate nature of the encounter became clear. This was no accident of the storm, but a carefully orchestrated plan to compromise Abigail's reputation by catching her alone with Jasper, under circumstances that could be painted in the worst possible light. "We sought shelter from the storm," Abigail stated firmly, "as anyone would." Sure, Martin agreed with exaggerated understanding. "Just taking shelter. Mighty convenient, though, ain't it? The religious lady who was too pure to marry Mr. Grant found alone with the reformed outlaw. What would your Ohio church friends say to that, I wonder?" Jasper's posture shifted subtly, a coiled tension that communicated readiness for violence. "You've had your look. Now leave." Martin made no move to depart, nor did his companions. "Actually, we're going to wait out the storm here too, and when we all ride into town together tomorrow, we'll be sure to tell everyone how we found you." His smile turned ugly. "Unless the lady would prefer we keep quiet about this little compromise of propriety." The implicit blackmail was clear. Abigail could either face ruinous gossip or agree to whatever terms Grant had authorized his men to offer. "I have nothing to hide," she replied steadily. "We've done nothing improper." "Won't matter what you've done," Martin countered. "Only what folks believe, and folks in Silver Creek will believe what Mr. Grant tells them to believe." He stepped closer, lowering his voice confidentially. "He's willing to be reasonable, you. No, leave town quietly, and this unfortunate incident need never become public knowledge." Abigail felt a surge of righteous anger at the calculated cruelty of Grant's scheme, to drive her away not through direct threats, but by destroying her character in the eyes of the community she was gradually becoming part of. "I will not be intimidated into abandoning my place here," she stated, her voice stronger than she felt. "Not by Mr. Grant, and certainly not by his messengers." Martin's face darkened. "Then you'll be known as the fallen angel of Silver Creek by sundown tomorrow. No one will hire you, house you, or associate with you." He glanced at Jasper. "Not even Sullivan here can protect your reputation once word spreads." "That's where you're wrong." Jasper's quiet statement drew everyone's attention. He had moved. Slightly away from Abigail, his stance relaxed but alert, blue eyes calculating as they assessed the three intruders. "How's that?" Martin challenged. "Because Miss Thornton will be Mrs. Sullivan by the time we reach town," Jasper replied evenly. "And a man's wife has every right to seek shelter with her husband during a storm." The line shack fell silent following Jasper's declaration, save for the persistent drumming of rain on the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Martin's face registered shock, then suspicion, his gaze darting between Jasper and Abigail. "Marriage!" he finally scoffed. "You expect anyone to believe Sullivan the lone wolf is suddenly taking a wife, and her, of all women?" He gestured dismissively toward Abigail. "The God-fearing Easterner and the former outlaw? That's less believable than finding you two here by accident." Jasper's expression remained impassive. "Believe what you want. Judge Perkins arrives tomorrow on his circuit. We've been waiting for his arrival to make it official." The confident assertion, delivered with such calm certainty, momentarily unsettled Martin and his companions. Abigail herself stood frozen, her mind racing to keep pace with this unexpected turn of events. She had not spoken a word since Jasper's pronouncement, too stunned by the implication of his improvised solution. Martin recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing. "Mighty convenient timing, almost like you made it up on the spot." "Think what you like," Jasper replied with a shrug. "But consider carefully what Grant will say when your discovery results in hastening our marriage rather than driving Miss Thornton from town. Somehow I doubt that's the outcome he's hoping for." This calculation visibly troubled Martin. He conferred briefly with his companions in hushed tones before turning back with diminished bravado. "This ain't over, Sullivan. If you're lying, then you'll have your scandal tomorrow," Jasper finished for him. "But if you're wrong, you'll have interfered with a private matter between a man and his intended wife, and I don't imagine Grant wants that kind of trouble." After another moment of tense standoff, Martin jerked his head toward the door. "Storm's letting up. We'll ride ahead, but don't think for a minute this changes anything. Grant doesn't forget those who cross him." "Neither do I," Jasper replied, quietly, the simple statement carrying more menace than any explicit threat. Once the three men had departed, the silence that settled between Abigail and Jasper was heavy with unspoken questions. Abigail moved to the small window, watching as Martin and his companions mounted their horses and disappeared into the rain-swept darkness. "They won't go far," Jasper observed, joining her at the window. "They'll watch to see when we leave, which direction we take." Abigail nodded, her mind still struggling to process the implications of what had just occurred. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was a complex mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "You proposed marriage," she stated, her tone carefully neutral, neither accepting nor rejecting. "I provided a solution to an immediate problem," Jasper clarified, his voice equally measured. "One that would neutralize Grant's attempt to compromise. You're standing in the community, a solution that involves a lifetime commitment," Abigail pointed out. "That seems disproportionate to the immediate threat." The ghost of a smile touched Jasper's lips. "Unless you were planning to leave Silver Creek once your reputation was ruined, the threat wasn't temporary. Grant won't stop until you're gone, or under his control." Abigail recognized the truth in his assessment. Grant's vendetta against her had escalated from economic pressure to attempted character assassination. Each new tactic revealed both his influence over the town and his determination to make an example of her rejection. "Even so," she said carefully, "marriage is a sacred covenant, not merely a strategic alliance against a common enemy." Jasper studied her face in the dim light of the dying fire. "You think I offered without understanding that?" "I think you acted to protect me," Abigail replied honestly, "as you have since we met." What I don't understand is why you would bind yourself permanently to a woman you barely know, whose values and faith might seem foreign to your way of life." Jasper was silent for a long moment, considering his response. When he spoke, his voice carried a depth of feeling she hadn't heard before. 8 years in territorial prison changes a man," he began. "You see humanity at its worst. Guards who enjoy cruelty, prisoners who've abandoned everything decent. Most men either break or harden completely." He moved away from the window, adding another log to the stove before continuing. "The chaplain I mentioned, Reverend Thomas Matthews, he'd visit weekly, bring books, lead services for whoever would attend. Most prisoners mocked him. Some just went for the break in routine. I avoided him entirely at first." A distant look entered Jasper's eyes. "One night there was a riot, bad one. Guards beat 3 men to death before restoring order. I wasn't involved, but caught a baton to the head anyway, ended up in the infirmary with a skull fracture." Abigail listened intently, recognizing that Jasper was sharing something deeply personal, perhaps something he had never told anyone in Silver Creek. "Matthews came every day for 2 weeks while I recovered. Read to me when I couldn't focus my eyes properly. Never preached, never condemned, just present." Jasper's hand unconsciously traced the scar on his face. "When I could finally speak again, I asked him why he bothered with men society had thrown away. Know what he said?" Abigail shook her head slightly. "He said, 'No soul is beyond redemption, Mr. Sullivan. God doesn't abandon his children even when they've abandoned him.'" Jasper's voice softened. "I didn't believe in redemption then, wasn't sure I believed in God. But I started attending his services, reading the books he brought, found something I'd lost years before, the possibility of becoming more than my worst decisions." The connection to her own faith touched Abigail deeply. "And when you saw me being pressured to compromise my beliefs, I recognized a faith that wasn't just words or Sunday appearances," Jasper confirmed. "The same honest conviction Matthews showed, even when it cost him the respect of proper society for ministering to criminals." He moved closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm not proposing from pity or mere strategic advantage, Abigail. These past weeks, watching you stand your ground against Grant, seeing how you care for folks at Doc's place, hearing you speak of your faith as something lived rather than displayed, I've grown to admire more than just your courage." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, causing Abigail's heart to quicken despite her rational caution. But significant questions remained. "Your past," she began carefully, "isn't hidden from you," he finished. "You know the worst of me already. Can't say that about most marriages." "And my faith?" This was crucial. She couldn't compromise on the centrality of her beliefs. "I don't share the depth of your conviction," Jasper acknowledged honestly, "but I respect it. More than that, I've seen how it guides you toward compassion rather than judgment, strength rather than bitterness. I don't find that threatening." A wry smile touched his lips. "Matthews would say your faith might be good for what remains of my soul." The storm outside had subsided to a gentle rainfall, matching the calming of the emotional turbulence within the cabin. Abigail moved to gather her still damp shawl, recognizing that they would need to depart soon if they were to reach Silver Creek by nightfall. "We should go," she said quietly. "Mrs. Whitaker will be worried." Jasper nodded, but made no move toward the door. "I need an answer, Abigail. Martin and his men will spread their version of events regardless. Without a clear response from us, Grant's narrative will prevail." Abigail hesitated, her mind weighing practical considerations against matters of the heart. She had come to Silver Creek expecting to marry a man she knew only through letters, believing God had guided her path. That arrangement had proved false, yet perhaps the journey itself had been divinely directed, leading her to this unexpected crossroads. "I need time," she finally said. "Not to decide whether to trust you. I already do. But marriage should be entered with clear eyes and full heart, not merely as a defense against scandal." "How much time?" Jasper asked practically. "Grant won't wait while you deliberate." Abigail considered this reality. "Until tomorrow morning," she decided. "I need to pray, to seek guidance. If this path is right, I need confirmation beyond practical necessity." Jasper accepted this with a respectful nod. "I'll bring you to the inn, then return in the morning for your answer." They rode into Silver Creek as twilight descended, the streets largely deserted, following the storm, except for a few curious onlookers who watched their arrival with undisguised interest. Martin had evidently wasted no time sowing seeds of gossip about finding them alone together in the line shack. Ruth Whitaker was waiting anxiously on the inn's porch, her relief at seeing Abigail safe quickly replaced by concern as she noted the lingering gazes of townsfolk. "Inside, quickly," she urged, after Jasper had helped Abigail down from the wagon. "There's been talk." "I know," Abigail replied calmly. "Mr. Sullivan and I encountered Mr. Grant's men during the storm." Ruth's expression darkened with understanding. "A deliberate trap, then. I feared as much when they rode through town earlier, watching the road despite the weather." To Jasper, who remained mounted on the wagon, Ruth asked bluntly, "What's your plan to address this? Grant's people are already spreading rumors that would destroy Abigail's reputation and your own standing, such as it is." Jasper met the older woman's forthright gaze steadily. "I've offered a solution. Miss Thornton is considering it overnight." Ruth's eyes widened slightly as she glanced between them, quickly discerning the nature of this solution. She nodded once, decisively. "Good, come inside, Abigail. You'll need dry clothes and a clear head for whatever decision morning brings." As Ruth guided her toward the door, Abigail turned back to Jasper. "Tomorrow at 9, she said simply, tipped his hat in acknowledgement before guiding the wagon toward the livery, aware of the watching eyes from the saloon and mercantile. Inside the warmth of the inn's kitchen, as Ruth bustled about preparing tea and dry clothes, Abigail found herself overwhelmed by the enormity of the choice before her. Marriage to a former outlaw, a man whose past contained violence she could hardly imagine, yet whose present actions demonstrated integrity and unexpected depth of character. "He proposed," she confirmed when Ruth finally settled across from her. At the kitchen table, having ensured Abigail was warm and dry. "Figured as much," Ruth replied, studying Abigail's troubled expression. "It's not what you expected when you came west, is it?" Abigail gave a small, humorless laugh. "Nothing has been what I expected since arriving in Silver Creek. Life rarely follows our carefully laid plans," Ruth observed wisely. "The question is whether this unexpected turn might actually be better than what you thought you wanted." "How can I know?" Abigail asked, vulnerability replacing her usual composure. "He's been kind, protective, even respectful of my faith. But marriage is forever, and his past is known," Ruth pointed out pragmatically. "Grant's past remains hidden behind respectability, yet which man has shown true character in his dealings with you?" The comparison struck Abigail forcefully. Maxwell Grant, with his veneer of success and propriety, had revealed himself to be manipulative and vindictive when denied his will. Jasper Sullivan, despite his reputation and openly acknowledged criminal history, had consistently demonstrated honor, respect, and a surprising sensitivity to her beliefs. "I need guidance," Abigail whispered, her fingers finding the small wooden cross at her neck. "Clarity." Ruth reached across the table to squeeze her hand gently. "Then seek it where you always have. I'll leave you to your prayers." Alone in her small room, Abigail knelt beside her bed, her father's Bible open before her. The familiar ritual of prayer had always brought comfort and direction, yet tonight she found her thoughts scattered, torn between practical considerations and the unexpected stirrings of her heart. "Lord," she whispered into the stillness, "show me your will in this. Is this unexpected path your provision, or merely human solution? Grant me wisdom beyond my understanding, and peace in whatever choice lies ahead." Outside her window, Silver Creek settled into uneasy slumber, unaware that by morning the balance of power within the small frontier town might shift irrevocably, depending on one woman's answer to an unexpected proposal. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with unusual clarity following the previous day's storm. The rain-washed streets and freshly scrubbed buildings seemed to gleam in the early morning light, as if the town itself had been purified by the deluge. Abigail stood at her window, watching as the community slowly awakened. She had slept little, her night filled with prayer and careful consideration of the path before her. Yet despite her exhaustion, a surprising sense of peace had settled over her as morning approached. Not the peace of perfect certainty, but of faithful surrender to what she now believed was divine guidance. A soft knock at her door preceded Ruth's entrance, carrying a tray with breakfast and fresh coffee. "Thought you might prefer to eat up here this morning," the older woman explained, setting the tray on the small desk. "The dining room's unusually busy for this hour. Seems half the town suddenly needs breakfast at the inn today." "Curiosity draws a crowd," Abigail observed wryly, grateful for Ruth's thoughtfulness. Ruth studied her face intently. "You look different this morning. Decided something, have you?" Abigail nodded, pouring coffee with steady hands. "I have. Care to share it with an old woman who won't sleep properly until she knows." A small smile touched Abigail's lips. "I'm going to accept Mr. Sullivan's proposal." Ruth released a breath she seemed to have been holding. "Can't say I'm surprised, but I am relieved. He's a good man, Abigail, despite his past. Better than most, who pretend to respectability in this town." "I believe that too," Abigail agreed, "though it's not only a practical decision." She hesitated, finding it difficult to articulate the complex emotions that had crystallized during her night of reflection. "There's something between us, a connection I never expected to find here. He sees me clearly, respects my faith, even without fully sharing it, and offers protection without demanding submission in return." "Sounds like the foundation for something genuine," Ruth observed. "More than many marriages begin with." "It's not what I imagined when I traveled west," Abigail admitted. "But perhaps God's plan was different from my own limited vision all along." Ruth squeezed her hand affectionately. "The Lord works in mysterious ways indeed. Now what's your plan for today? Sullivan said he'd return at 9. And I expect half the town will be watching when he does," Abigail replied, glancing at the growing number of people lingering in the street below, their attention poorly disguised as routine morning business. "Which might serve our purpose better than a private conversation." Ruth's eyebrows rose in appreciation of Abigail's strategic thinking. "A public acceptance would certainly control the narrative more effectively than letting gossip fester." "Exactly." Abigail moved to her wardrobe, selecting her finest remaining dress, a deep blue garment with modest lace at the throat and wrists. "If Silver Creek wants a spectacle, we'll provide one that serves truth rather than rumor." By 9:15, Abigail had positioned herself on the inn's front porch, ostensibly engaged in mending linens, but clearly visible to the unusually active main street. Ruth had arranged a small table and 2 comfortable chairs, making it evident they anticipated a visitor. At precisely 9 o'clock, Jasper Sullivan appeared at the end of the street, riding his horse rather than driving the wagon. He had clearly taken pains with his appearance, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, wearing a fresh shirt under his usual riding coat. Several townspeople paused in their activities to watch as he dismounted outside the inn and approached the porch, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. "Miss Thornton," He greeted her formally, aware of their audience. "I trust you rested well after yesterday's ordeal." "As well as could be expected, Mr. Sullivan," Abigail replied, setting aside her mending and gesturing to the empty chair. "Please, join me." As Jasper took the offered seat, Abigail noted Maxwell Grant emerging from the mercantile across the street, his expression darkening as he observed their meeting. She also spotted Martin and one of his companions from the previous day, lingering near the saloon with poorly concealed interest. "You've drawn quite a crowd," she observed quietly. "Not me they're watching," Jasper replied, his eyes meeting hers with unspoken question. Abigail took a steadying breath. This was the moment that would irrevocably alter her path in Silver Creek, and quite possibly reshape the town's future as well. "I've considered your proposal carefully, Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice clear enough to carry to those nearest the porch. "Both its practical necessity and its deeper implications." Jasper nodded once, waiting patiently for her conclusion. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," Abigail continued, "not to be entered lightly or for mere convenience. It requires mutual respect, honest communication, and shared purpose, even when beliefs may differ in certain aspects." She was aware that her words carried beyond Jasper to the listening town, establishing the seriousness with which she approached this decision. "I believe you offer those essential qualities," she stated firmly, "and I accept your proposal with a clear conscience and willing heart." The simple declaration, delivered with quiet dignity, created an immediate ripple through the watching townsfolk. Abigail could see shock, speculation, and, from some quarters, genuine pleasure at this unexpected development. Jasper's expression remained composed, though something warm flickered in his eyes. "You honor me with your acceptance," he replied formally. Then, reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I hope this meets with your approval." From the pouch he produced a simple gold band set with a small pearl. Modest, but undeniably elegant, clearly not purchased hastily that morning, but selected with care. "It's beautiful," Abigail said sincerely, genuinely surprised by the ring's existence. As Jasper slipped it onto her finger, the symbolism of the moment was lost on none of the observers. Across the street, Maxwell Grant's face contorted with fury before he turned sharply and disappeared into the mercantile. Martin and his companion exchanged uncertain glances. Their planned gossip campaign suddenly transformed into confirmation of an engagement rather than a scandal. Ruth, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward with a small tray, bearing 3 cups. "I believe this calls for coffee to seal the arrangement," she announced with barely concealed satisfaction, "and perhaps discussion of when you plan to formalize this engagement." "Judge Perkins arrives on today's stage," Jasper replied, accepting the offered cup. "If Miss Thornton is amenable, I see no reason for delay." "Today?" Abigail couldn't hide her surprise at this accelerated timeline. "Grant won't waste time regrouping," Jasper explained quietly, "and legal protection is stronger than a mere announcement." "Sensible," Ruth agreed before Abigail could respond. "I'll spread the word. 4 o'clock at the church would allow time for preparations while catching the judge before he begins court business tomorrow." The decisiveness with which both Ruth and Jasper approached these practical matters momentarily overwhelmed Abigail. The peaceful certainty of her decision remained, but the rapid transformation from consideration to implementation left her slightly breathless. 4 o'clock, she echoed, finding her voice. Yes, that would be suitable. News of the impending wedding spread through Silver Creek with impressive speed. By midday, Abigail had received visits from Sarah Jenkins and her mother, offering to help with preparations. Doc Harker bringing a small posy of wildflowers from his garden as a wedding gift. And even William Patterson, the school board chairman, who awkwardly indicated that the teaching position might still be available given the changed circumstances. "Marrying Sullivan changes their calculations," Ruth observed, as she helped Abigail prepare for the ceremony. "You'll no longer be the vulnerable outsider Grant can intimidate, but a woman with protection and standing of your own." Is that all they see? Abigail wondered aloud. A strategic alliance rather than a genuine union? People understand what their experience allows, Ruth replied wisely. Many marriages here begin as practical arrangements. That yours might contain deeper feeling makes it unusual, not less authentic. As 4 o'clock approached, Abigail dressed in her finest outfit, the same blue dress she had worn that morning, now adorned with the small wildflower bouquet from Doc Harker. She had no wedding finery, no family to attend her, yet the simplicity felt appropriate for a union founded on straightforward honesty rather than elaborate pretense. The small church, which had seemed so unwelcoming during her first Sunday service, had been hastily but lovingly decorated by Sarah and several other young women who seemed delighted by the romantic drama unfolding in their usually uneventful town. Wildflowers tied with ribbon adorned the ends of each pew, and clean lamps cast a warm glow against the approaching dusk. To Abigail's surprise, nearly half the town had gathered for the ceremony. Some undoubtedly came from mere curiosity, others, perhaps at Grant's direction, to report back on the proceedings, but many faces showed genuine goodwill. Doc Harker, beaming from the front pew, the Jenkins family, dressed in their Sunday best, even a few miners and ranchers who had benefited from Abigail's careful attention at the doctor's cabin. Judge Perkins, a corpulent man with shrewd eyes and a judicial demeanor, waited at the front of the church alongside Reverend Thomas, whose discomfort was poorly disguised. The Reverend had clearly been caught between his loyalty to Maxwell Grant and his duty to perform marriages for his parishioners, ultimately unable to refuse without exposing his compromised position too openly. As Abigail walked alone down the short aisle, her eyes found Jasper waiting at the altar. He stood tall and dignified in a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the sharp contrast of his prematurely silver-streaked hair. The scar along his jawline, which had once seemed fearsome to her, now appeared as simply another aspect of his history, a visible reminder of the path that had led him to this unexpected moment. The ceremony itself was brief and straightforward, with Judge Perkins handling most of the proceedings, while Reverend Thomas provided only the minimum religious elements required by tradition. Abigail spoke her vows clearly, finding unexpected emotion welling up as she promised to honor and cherish this man whose protection had expanded to include his name, his home, and his future. When Jasper spoke his vows in return, the depth of sincerity in his voice silenced even the most skeptical whispers among the congregation. His hand remained steady as he placed the gold band on her finger again, this time permanently, and his eyes never left hers as he promised fidelity and care for as long as they both should live. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana," Judge Perkins pronounced, "I now declare you husband and wife." The simple words spoken with judicial finality transformed Abigail Thornton into Abigail Sullivan, binding her life to a man she had known for less than a month, yet one she trusted more instinctively than the correspondent she had exchanged letters with for nearly a year before traveling west. As they turned to face the assembled witnesses, Abigail noticed a figure standing at the back of the church. Maxwell Grant, his expression unreadable as he observed the culmination of a union that directly challenged his authority in Silver Creek. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room before Grant turned and departed, the closing door punctuating his exit, like the ending of one chapter and the beginning of another. Outside the church, well-wishers surrounded them with congratulations and surprisingly warm acceptance. Doc Harker clapped Jasper on the shoulder with genuine affection, while Sarah Jenkins embraced Abigail tightly, whispering, "I knew you'd find your place here, Even Sheriff Miller offered a grudging handshake to Jasper, his previous harassment, apparently set aside in recognition of the town's shifting dynamics. As twilight descended on Silver Creek, Jasper helped Abigail into his wagon for the short journey to what would now be their shared home, the ranch north of town that had been a point of contention between Jasper and Maxwell Grant since his arrival. "Ready?" he asked quietly, offering her one final opportunity to reconsider the irrevocable step they had taken. Abigail looked back at the town where she had arrived as a mail-order bride, been rejected for her faith, and ultimately found an unexpected path forward. Then she turned to the man beside her, whose scarred face had become dear to her with surprising speed. "Yes," she replied simply. "I'm ready." As they departed, neither noticed the small gathering at the mercantile. Grant and several of his most loyal associates engaged in intense conversation that occasionally broke off as they glanced toward the departing wagon. The battle for Silver Creek had entered a new phase, and Maxwell Grant was not a man who accepted defeat graciously or permanently. The Sullivan Ranch house surprised Abigail with its unexpected charm, though modest in size compared to the grander Eastern homes she had known. The sturdy two-story structure had been built with evident care and attention to detail. Wide windows captured the breathtaking mountain views. Handcrafted furniture filled the rooms with simple elegance, and bookshelves lined one entire wall of the main sitting room, filled with volumes ranging from practical ranching manuals to dog-eared classics of literature. "You have a library," Abigail observed with genuine delight as Jasper showed her through what was now her home. A rare, full smile softened his scarred features. "Reverend Matthews started me reading in prison. Became a habit I couldn't break. Even out here, the discovery of this shared love for books represented just one of many small revelations during their first week of marriage. Each day brought new insights into the man she had wed. His preference for coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in, his meticulous care for his horses, his habit of reading by lamplight late into the night. They established a routine that respected both their new intimacy and the boundaries of their still-developing relationship. Jasper had insisted Abigail take the main bedroom, while he used the smaller second room, an arrangement that simultaneously protected her dignity and demonstrated his respect for the unusual circumstances of their union. Marriage should develop naturally, not under pressure of scandal or necessity, he had explained simply. Some things shouldn't be rushed. This consideration only deepened Abigail's growing affection for her husband. Here was a man whose violent past might have destroyed any capacity for gentleness, yet who demonstrated more thoughtful respect than Maxwell Grant had ever shown beneath his veneer of civilization. Abigail continued her work with Doc Harker, now traveling to his cabin twice weekly with Jasper or one of his ranch hands as escort. The controversy surrounding their marriage had actually increased demand for her services, as many women who had previously avoided association with the religious spinster now found the wife of Jasper Sullivan an acceptable person to consult about minor ailments or herbal remedies. "Funny how respectability works out here," Doc observed wryly, as Abigail prepared remedies for 3 different mining families. "Same knowledge, same person, different reception based entirely on whose name you carry." "Human nature, I suppose," Abigail replied, carefully labeling each bottle. "Though I admit I find it somewhat disheartening how quickly opinions change, based on perception rather than substance." "Not everyone," Doc corrected. "Sullivan recognized your worth immediately, saw past circumstances to character, rare quality in a man." The truth of this observation settled deeply in Abigail's heart. While many in Silver Creek now accepted her based on her married status, Jasper had valued her integrity and courage when she stood entirely alone. Their peaceful routine might have continued indefinitely had Maxwell Grant been a man capable of accepting defeat. But as October gave way to November and the first snows dusted the distant peaks, signs of his continued opposition began to emerge. First came economic pressure. Supplies Jasper had routinely purchased from the mercantile suddenly became unavailable or priced exorbitantly high. When he switched to ordering through the mail or traveling to neighboring settlements, mysterious delays plagued the deliveries, and roads to alternative trading posts developed washouts that coincidentally affected only Sullivan's wagons. Next came legal harassment. Sheriff Miller appeared at the ranch with claims of property line disputes, water rights violations, and unpaid taxes, all fabricated, all requiring Jasper's presence in town to resolve, all ultimately dismissed by Judge Perkins during his monthly circuit, but not before consuming valuable time and creating continual disruption. "He's testing our resolve," Jasper observed one evening as they sat before the fire after another day spent addressing baseless accusations. "Looking for weakness, pressure points, any vulnerability he can exploit." Abigail set aside her mending, studying her husband's tired face. The constant strain was taking its toll on both of them, though neither complained. "What does he ultimately want? The ranch?" "Partly," Jasper acknowledged. "The property controls access to the northern mining claims, but it's more than that. Now," his blue eyes met hers directly, "it's about power. Grant can't allow someone to successfully defy him and remain in Silver Creek. Sets a dangerous precedent for his authority. Then why not force us out through these tactics until we give up?" Abigail asked practically. Jasper's expression darkened. "Because surrender isn't enough. He needs to break us publicly, make an example that ensures no one else attempts resistance." The best grim assessment hung in the air between them, disturbing the peaceful sanctuary they had created. Abigail reached across to take Jasper's hand, the simple touch conveying solidarity that transcended words. "We won't break," she stated with quiet certainty. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The true nature of Grant's ultimate strategy became clear a week later when Sarah Jenkins arrived at the ranch in her family's wagon, her usually cheerful face tight with worry. "It's Pa," she explained as Abigail welcomed her inside. "He's been arrested for theft. Sheriff Miller claims he stole merchandise from the mercantile, but it's not true. Pa hasn't even been to the store in weeks since Mr. Grant raised all the prices." Jasper, who had been repairing tack at the kitchen table, set aside his work. "What evidence does Miller claim to have?" "That's the awful part," Sarah continued, twisting her hands anxiously. "They found mercantile goods in our stable, expensive items we could never afford. Someone planted them there, but Miller won't listen. Judge Perkins isn't due for another 3 weeks, and they're keeping Pa locked up until then." The implications were immediately clear to both Abigail and Jasper. Grant had shifted tactics, now targeting those who had shown friendship to the Sullivans rather than attacking them directly. "It's my fault," Sarah whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Mr. Grant warned Pa to stop doing business with you folks, but he said he wouldn't be dictated to about who he could associate with." "It's not your fault," Abigail assured her firmly. "Neither yours nor your father's. This is Grant's doing alone." Jasper rose, his decision already made. "I'll go into town, speak with Miller, perhaps post bail if they'll allow it." "That's what they want," Abigail realized suddenly. "To draw you into town, separate us." Jasper nodded grimly. "Likely so, but we can't leave Jenkins to suffer for our battle." "Then I'll come with you," Abigail declared, already reaching for her shawl. "No." Jasper's response was immediate and firm. "If there's trouble, better to have you safely here." Abigail met his gaze directly. "If there's trouble, better to face it together. You said it yourself. Grant wants to separate us, thinking we're weaker apart. Let's prove him wrong." The subtle shift in their relationship was evident in this exchange. No longer protector and protected, but partners facing a shared threat with complementary strengths. After a moment's consideration, Jasper nodded his agreement. "Stay close," he conceded, "and at the first sign of genuine danger, you get to safety regardless of my situation. Promise me that much." By late afternoon, their wagon approached Silver Creek, the town unusually quiet for that hour. As they passed the livery, they noticed Jenkins' establishment shuttered and locked, while the saloon seemed to be doing unusually brisk business despite the early hour. "Something's not right," Jasper murmured, his experienced eye noting details Abigail might have missed. Men watching too intently from windows, the absence of women and children from the streets, horses already saddled and waiting outside establishments where they would normally be stabled. "It feels like the town is holding its breath," Abigail observed as they continued toward the sheriff's office. As they drew closer, the office door opened and Maxwell Grant himself emerged, followed by Sheriff Miller. Grant's expression upon seeing them confirmed what they had already suspected. This had been a carefully laid trap. "Sullivan," Grant called, his voice carrying in the unnaturally quiet street. "How predictable you'd come running when one of your friends faced trouble. Loyalty is so often the downfall of men like you." Jasper drew the wagon to a stop, positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail, though they sat side by side. "Where's Jenkins?" he demanded, ignoring Grant's provocations. "Safe enough," Miller replied, hooking his thumbs in his gun belt with exaggerated casualness. "Though that could change depending on how today's business concludes." "And what business would that be?" Jasper asked, his voice deceptively calm, despite the tension evident in his posture. Grant stepped forward, assuming control of the conversation. "Simple enough. I've recently acquired the note on your property from the Territorial Bank. Seems the previous owner left some debts unresolved when he sold to you." "That's a lie," Jasper stated flatly. "I paid cash outright with no encumbrances, have the deed to prove it." "Paperwork gets complicated," Grant countered, with a thin smile. "Mistakes happen. The bank's records show an outstanding note that supersedes your claim. Unless settled immediately, I'm within my rights to claim the property." The brazen attempt to steal the ranch through fraudulent financial claims revealed the depths of Grant's desperation and the extent of his influence with territorial officials who would process such dubious paperwork. "You're braver than most. Swindlers," Jasper observed coldly. "Most prefer not to announce their crimes in front of witnesses." "Witnesses?" Grant laughed, gesturing around the empty street. "I see a disreputable ex-convict and his misguided wife making baseless accusations against a respected businessman. Sheriff Miller certainly doesn't see any crime occurring, do you, Sheriff?" Miller shook his head with exaggerated regret. "Just a civil matter between property owners, far as I can tell." The careful orchestration of this confrontation became increasingly evident. Grant had ensured no neutral witnesses would be present. The sheriff was firmly in his pocket, and most townspeople who might have supported the Sullivans had been intimidated into staying away. Abigail, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly understood with perfect clarity what was happening. "This isn't about the ranch at all," she stated, her voice carrying in the quiet street. "You could have filed these false claims without." This theatrical confrontation, Grant's eyes narrowed as they shifted to her. "Perhaps I simply wanted the satisfaction of seeing Sullivan's face when he realized he'd lost everything." "No," Abigail continued with growing certainty. "You needed to provoke Jasper into violence. That's why you arrested Mr. Jenkins, why you're making these outrageous claims publicly rather than through legal channels. You want Jasper to attack you, giving Sheriff Miller justification to kill him." The momentary flicker in Grant's expression confirmed her assessment. A property dispute might eventually be disproven in court, but a former outlaw shot while attacking a respected citizen would raise few questions and would leave his widow vulnerable and isolated once more. Jasper's hand found Abigail's briefly, a silent acknowledgement of her insight and a reassurance that he wouldn't fall into the obvious trap. "Your wife is quite perceptive, Sullivan," Grant observed, recovering his composure, "though it changes nothing. Either sign over the deed right now, or Jenkins faces trial for theft with evidence ensuring conviction. His daughter might face similar charges as an accomplice." Before Jasper could respond, another voice entered the confrontation, deep, authoritative, and entirely unexpected. "That would be difficult to accomplish, Mr. Grant, since both the alleged stolen goods and Mr. Jenkins are currently in my custody." All heads turned to see Judge Perkins approaching from the direction of the telegraph office, accompanied by 2 federal marshals and a very much unfettered Thomas Jenkins. "Your Honor," Sheriff Miller stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling. "Instantly. We weren't expecting you for another 3 weeks." "Evidently," Perkins replied dryly, "which is precisely why I altered my schedule after receiving some very concerning telegrams from Denver regarding fraudulent banking documents being filed in Silver Creek." He fixed Grant with a penetrating stare. "Documents bearing your signature, Mr. Grant, but purportedly from banking officials who deny any knowledge of them." The sudden reversal left Grant momentarily speechless, his carefully constructed scheme collapsing around him. The marshals moved to flank him, their presence eliminating any possibility of escape. "This is absurd," Grant finally managed, attempting to recapture his authoritative tone. "A misunderstanding that can be easily explained." "I look forward to hearing that explanation," Judge Perkins replied evenly, "along with your response to charges of fraud, witness intimidation, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder." He gestured to the marshals. "Gentlemen, please, escort Mr. Grant and Sheriff Miller to the jail. I believe we have much to discuss." As the marshals led the sputtering Grant and a resigned Miller away, Perkins turned to the Sullivans with a hint of satisfaction in his judicial demeanor. "Mrs. Sullivan," he acknowledged with a respectful nod, "your telegram last week was most illuminating. The detailed documentation you provided regarding Mr. Grant's systematic abuses of power gave us precisely what we needed to investigate officially." Jasper turned to Abigail with surprise. "You contacted Judge Perkins?" "After Sarah mentioned the judge wouldn't return for 3 weeks, I realized Grant had timed his move carefully," Abigail explained. "It seemed prudent to inform the judge about the pattern we'd observed and request his earlier intervention." "More than prudent," Perkins confirmed. "Potentially life-saving, given what appears to have been planned here today." As the shock of Grant's arrest rippled through Silver Creek, townsfolk began to emerge cautiously onto the street, drawn by the unexpected confrontation and its extraordinary conclusion. Sarah rushed to embrace her father, while Doc Harker approached the Sullivans with evident relief. "Never doubted you'd find a way through," the old doctor declared, though his expression belied the confident words. "Though I admit, having federal marshals appear was a theatrical touch I didn't anticipate. Within hours, the town's atmosphere had transformed dramatically. Those who had been coerced into supporting Grant now spoke openly about his threats and manipulations. Others who had genuinely believed in his business acumen found themselves reconsidering their judgment in light of the federal charges. As evening fell, Jasper and Abigail sat together on Ruth Whitaker's porch, having accepted her invitation to stay overnight rather than making the journey back to their ranch in darkness. The events of the day had left them exhausted but vindicated, the immediate threat removed, though the impact on Silver Creek would continue to unfold in the coming weeks. "You saved more than our ranch today," Jasper observed quietly, his hand covering Abigail's where it rested between them. "You may have saved the entire town from Grant's influence." "We saved it together," Abigail corrected gently. "Your courage In standing against him, gave others permission to question his authority. My organizational skills simply helped document the pattern clearly enough for legal action. The complementary nature of their strengths had never been more evident, Jasper's unflinching resolve providing the foundation for Abigail's meticulous planning, her faith giving purpose to his protective instincts. "I never expected marriage. When I came west," Abigail mused, watching as stars appeared above the darkening mountains. "Certainly not to a man with your colorful history." Jasper's expression softened with rare humor. "And I never expected to find redemption through a mail-order bride too religious for another man's taste." His voice grew more serious as he added, "Yet here we are, stronger together than either of us alone." Abigail turned to face him fully, recognizing the truth of his words on multiple levels. Their unusual union had begun as a practical solution to an immediate threat, evolved into a partnership of mutual respect, and now stood poised at the threshold of something deeper. "When I first arrived in Silver Creek, I prayed to understand God's purpose in bringing me to such a difficult place," she said softly. "I couldn't imagine how rejection and hardship could possibly be part of a divine plan." "And now?" Jasper asked, his scarred face illuminated by the warm light spilling from Ruth's windows, the roughness of his past plainly visible, yet somehow transformed by the man he had chosen to become. "Now I see that sometimes we must lose what we think we want, to discover what we truly need," Abigail replied, her hand turning beneath his to interlace their fingers. "That faith isn't tested in comfort, but in challenge, and that redemption sometimes comes in forms we never anticipated." As Silver Creek settled into its first night free from Maxwell Grant's influence, Jasper and Abigail Sullivan sat together. In comfortable silence, their unexpected journey from rejection to redemption, embodying a truth as old as faith itself. That divine providence often works through the most unlikely circumstances to bring healing not just to individual lives, but to entire communities desperately in need of renewal. In the months and years that followed, Silver Creek would transform under their combined influence. Jasper's fair business practices setting a new standard for local commerce, while Abigail's eventual position as the town's teacher brought educational opportunity to a generation of children raised with both practical knowledge and spiritual values. Their home became known as a place of hospitality and justice, where those in need could find assistance and those seeking purpose could find inspiration. And in the quiet moments between their public responsibilities, they continued to discover the profound blessing that had emerged from apparent rejection, a love built not on illusion or advantage, but on the solid foundation of genuine character, tested by adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.